Is the audio working? It just went entirely blank. I feel like we lost the satellite feed, or maybe the storm finally took out the local grid.
Yes, I think it's working perfectly. That sound, or lack thereof, is the point. That is the auditory representation of your mind waiting for an external signal that isn't coming. We call that experience the white silence.
I feel an immediate physical surge of anxiety. I keep wanting to check my levels, to tap the microphone, to produce something. It's almost painful. It's like waiting for the beat to drop in music, and it never does, so your internal rhythm starts to fight itself.
That anxiety, that instant, uncomfortable physical demand for stimulation, is the psychological core of our deep dive today. Our mission is to unpack the white silence, the suffocating intersection of environmental psychology, sensory deprivation, and existential dread found in isolation. We're looking at the mechanism by which the mind panics when the external world is stripped away, forcing it to cannibalize itself.
Normalize itself, wow.
And that urge you felt, that need to find a pattern or a signal in the void, is driven by a profound clinical trigger, the Ganzfeld effect. The Ganzfeld effect.
Okay. The term literally means entire field in German. It is exposure to a uniform, unstructured stimulation field, what you might experience in a blinding whiteout blizzard, or what occurs in specialized sensory deprivation chambers.
So the brain registers the external environment as hostile, not because it's loud, but because it is too uniform, too neutral.
Exactly. The brain is the ultimate pattern-seeking machine. If you deprive it of sufficient external information, if the field of vision is entirely white, or the auditory input is entirely silent, the neural structures responsible for perception don't simply shut down.
They fight back.
They attempt to manufacture the input they crave. Think about long-haul truck drivers navigating featureless stretches of highway at night, or high-altitude pilots flying through cloud cover. They often report complex geometric hallucinations, or even hearing phantom voices.
Right.
Your urge to check your volume, to demand a sound where none exists, is the direct psychological mirroring of the Ganzfeld effect. You are demanding a pattern, and if the silence persists, your brain will soon start generating its own. Okay, so let's unpack this. We are moving past just simple boredom and into the architecture of internal dread. We're talking about the void outside forcing a deep internal psychological collapse. The isolation isn't static, it's an active force.
What's fascinating here is how the source material consistently elevates the isolated, snowy landscape from mere setting to an active, malevolent antagonist. In the lexicon of winter horror, snow is never passive. It is a negative canvas of immense and indifferent silence. It doesn't offer peace, it offers oppression.
An impression of nothingness.
And this concept of the terrifying white void is rooted deep in literary and philosophical history. We have to look at Herman Melville's discussion of whiteness in Moby Dick. Melville dedicates an entire unsettling chapter to whiteness, arguing it is fundamentally terrifying, not pure. He describes it as a dumb blankness and a colorless all-color that represents the existential void itself.
That's a crucial subversion, isn't it? I mean, historically, especially in Western traditions, white often symbolizes innocence, purity, or even divinity. Melville just flips that completely on its head.
Absolutely. Melville understood that while a single instance of white, a lamb, a flower is pure, the absolute whiteness of a whale or an endless blizzard is terrifying because it lacks definition. It absorbs all other colors, yet gives nothing back. He calls it an atheism, from which the soul instinctively shrinks.
An atheism.
This featureless whiteness forces the isolated protagonist to confront their own insignificance, demanding that they find meaning where the universe offers only indifference. It's the visual equivalent of the Ganzfeld effect, a sensory void that invites madness.
Which means that endless, snow-blind horizon becomes a projection screen upon which the subconscious casts its darkest contents. It has to fill the space.
Precisely. And that desperate need for internal pattern recognition leads directly to the clinical phenomenon we call the prisoner's cinema.
Prisoner's cinema.
While the Ganzfeld is the external trigger, the prisoner's cinema is the internal neurological result. Clinically, it involves complex, often vibrant hallucinations, swirling nebulae, intricate geometric light shows, intense flashes of color. These are reported by people in environments of extreme isolation, prisoners in solitary confinement, explorers in polar darkness, or those subjected to prolonged dark water flotation.
So the brain is just making movies for itself because it's so bored?
In a way. The visual cortex, starved of external patterns, becomes hyper-excitable and begins firing randomly, creating internal phosphenes in manufactured sites that are completely unique to the isolated mind.
So if the world outside is blank, The darkest parts of the self take over. And this is where the shelter, the cabin, the base, the lighthouse stops being a sanctuary and starts being a tomb. The place we built to hide from the void ends up being where the void catches up to us.
That structural betrayal is the psychological pivot rooted in Sigmund Freud's seminal essay Das Unheimliche, or the uncanny.
The uncanny, I've heard that term.
Freud posits that the uncanny is not merely something new or alien. It is something which is familiar and old established in the mind, and which has become alienated from it only through the process of repression.
So it's not a ghost, it's something I already knew but forgot or forced myself to forget?
Exactly. And to understand the power of the uncanny in isolation, we have to look at the German word Heimlich. It has two contradictory meanings. It means homely, familiar, and intimate, but it also means concealed or secret.
That's weird. How can it mean both?
Because what is most familiar is also what is most hidden within the family, within the self. Therefore, its opposite, unheimlich, the uncanny, signifies the unhomely, that secret or oppressed thing that was hidden but has now violently and aggressively come to light.
The uncanny valley of the home. The architecture is right, the layout is right, but everything feels profoundly, fundamentally wrong. The domestic sphere ceases to be a shelter and becomes a calculated prison.
And isolation acts like a magnifying glass on Freud's key triggers for the uncanny. It amplifies the doubling of the self, which leads to the paranoia of the doppelganger or shadow self, and the animation of inanimate objects.
The chair isn't just a chair anymore.
Without the constant social distraction of normal life, you are forced to confront your own double, the darker impulses, guilt, or repressed trauma you usually manage to keep beneath the surface. Empirical observation supports this. Researchers noted that even psychologically healthy individuals, when subjected to harrowing isolation, hallucinates after a short while. The cabin isn't haunted by external entities. It's haunted by the inhabitants' own denied, repressed history,
So the walls don't talk. The mind talks through the walls.
forcing the repressed back into the light.
And then there's the sound of the isolation, the silence itself. It becomes a physical weight pressing down on you.
Absolutely. The silence becomes what we call an acousmatic presence. The term, originally coined by the Pythagoreans, refers to a sound without a visible cause. In extreme isolation, the auditory system enters a state of high alert hypervigilance because the brain interprets the absence of expected noise as the ultimate threat.
So silence is a warning sign.
The barrier between internal reality and external sound collapses because the brain is amplifying internal noise, tiny, insignificant external sounds. A floorboard creak, the dripping of a faucet, are magnified into a thunderclap.
A thunderclap signaling a potential threat that the mind is now purely generating on its own.
The silence is not peaceful. It is the hostile sound of everything not happening.
If the outside environment is this terrifying blank antagonist, then the cinematic horror we see must be modeled on something real, something clinical.
It is. The environment of the white, silent landscape is deeply mirrored by a very specific, real-world psychological weapon: white torture.
Wait, torture, that sounds exactly like what it is.
It is a method used in custodial settings, designed specifically to dismantle identity through total sensory deprivation. The victim is placed in an environment of total homogeneity. White walls, white clothing, white sound masking, even white food.
White food.
The intent is to remove all external markers of time and space, eliminating the cognitive friction necessary to maintain a coherent self. Victims report that they feel their mind gradually falling apart, silent and merciless.
My God!
The snowbound landscapes we analyze Antarctica, the overlook, the isolated rock function as vast, natural white torture chambers.
That sounds horrific. The loss of self, yes, but also the total obliteration of time.
That's the introduction of chronophobia. It's not just the fear of time, but the loss of temporal structure. Time is fundamentally a social construct. We anchor our days with routine, sun, clocks, and interaction.
All the things you lose out there.
In the timeless, placeless, and inhuman void of isolation, those anchors vanish. There is no distinguishable yesterday or tomorrow. There's only an eternal, terrifying, unstructured now.
Which would drive anyone insane.
This lack of chronological friction leads to a rapid disintegration of the personality structure. Without the continuity provided by objective time, the self starts to drift, prone to fugue states and radical shifts in mood. The isolation environment is not just a setting. It starts acting as a solvent, slowly dissolving the glue that holds the psyche together.
Wait, how quickly does this mental scaffolding fail? I need some structure right now, even if the world we are talking about is losing it. Can you walk us through the established stages of psychological breakdown?
Certainly. Research into long-duration isolation provides a clear, if terrifying, structure for this descent. There are 5 stages that map the cognitive journey from initial optimism down to total collapse.
Okay, stage 1.
Stage 1, the tabula rasa. This is the initial phase, often characterized by pronounced optimism and zeal.
The fresh start.
Exactly. The protagonist views the isolation as a new beginning, a desire for focused creative writing or perhaps scientific discovery. This is the illusion that the environment is neutral and that the self can be rewritten upon a clean slate, oblivious to the environment's hostility.
Which never lasts. Stage 2.
Stage 2, sensory hunger. The oppressive silence sets in, marking the true onset of cabin fever. Hypervigilance, irritability, and the acousmatic focus begins. The brain starts amplifying internal noise, and the individual struggles desperately against the void, manifesting psychosomatic illnesses or radical mood swings. Sleep becomes disrupted.
Okay, so you're jumpy, you're sick, you can't sleep.
Then comes stage 3, the uncanny valley.
The uncanny again.
Paranoia sets in. The familiar surroundings feel profoundly wrong or doubled. The individual begins to suspect inanimate objects or develops the persistent, unnerving feeling of being watched by an unseen entity. This is where the repressed trauma violently resurfaces and the distinction between internal and external threat blurs.
And stage 4 must be full-blown psychosis.
Stage 4, projective psychosis. Sensory deprivation reaches its destructive peak. Hallucinations become complex and frequent, the prisoner's cinema takes over, and internal guilt is externalized into concrete external threats, like phantom entities or physical intruders. This stage is dominated by apophenia,
Apophenia.
the compulsive perception of meaningful, often threatening, patterns in entirely random data, such as seeing faces in wood grain or hearing secret messages in static.
And the last stage, stage 5.
Stage V, solipsistic collapse.
It sounds final.
It is the total catastrophic isolation. It often leads to violence, ego death, and the ultimate philosophical horror, ontological nihilism. This is the devastating belief that nothing outside the self, including objective reality, truly exists, resulting in the aggressive or violent destruction of the other.
That last one. The destruction of the other. That brings us to the deepest philosophical horror of isolation, doesn't it? The sheer impossibility of ever truly proving that anyone else is actually real.
It is the ultimate intellectual prison, the problem of other minds. In a functional social environment, the constant, complex, and unpredictable interaction confirms the existence of other minds, that everyone around you is a conscious, feeling being.
But when that's gone,
In extreme, impermeable isolation, that certainty dissolves. Solipsism leaves the isolated person trapped in what we call the impermeable prison cell of subjective awareness. It fosters the terrifying suspicion that the other, the spouse, the colleague, the fellow explorer, is merely a simulation, a projection, a sophisticated biological automaton.
and if they're not real, then anything is permitted.
Once objective reality dissolves due to the white silence, the presence of another consciousness becomes a profound threat to the isolated person's own remaining unstable reality.
Which feels like a perfect transition to a place like the Overlook Hotel.
If the isolated cabin is the traditional psychological laboratory, Stanley Kubrick's The Shining transforms that laboratory into a maximum security institution. The Overlook Hotel is far more than a haunted house. It is a clinical study of surveillance, architectural oppression, and power panopticon.
Okay, let's unpack this. The hotel as a conscious machine of control.
Exactly. The panopticon model, developed by Jeremy Bentham and analyzed by Michel Foucault, is an architectural concept where the prisoner is constantly visible to the guard, but the guard remains invisible to the prisoner,
So you always feel like you're being watched.
which forces the inmate to internalize the invisible gaze, becoming their own self-regulating jailer. In The Shining, the hotel itself assumes the role of this invisible total guard. The hotel's shine, its telepathic network of surveillance, ensures that nothing is truly private.
And that camera, the Steadicam, it feels like it's hunting them.
Crucially, Kubrick's revolutionary use of the Steadicam emphasizes this panoptic gaze. It glides through the endless corridors with a supernatural, objective smoothness, trailing Jack and Danny like an unblinking eye that always knows where they are and what they're thinking.
And Jack Torrance, who believes he's the caretaker, the temporary guard, is in reality the most critical prisoner.
He is structurally the object of information, never the subject in communication. The vast open spaces of the hotel, which should offer freedom, only offer maximum exposure.
Right.
The scene in the Gold Room, where he speaks with the ghostly bartender Lloyd, is his moment of total assimilation. He accepts the identity imposed by the institution's history, You have always been the caretaker.
The inmate accepts the identity imposed by the prison. He gives up.
He sheds his former self. And this control is reinforced by a calculated assault on reality known as the spatial uncanny. The horror of the overlook is structural, based on impossible geometries. Architectural analysts have confirmed that the hotel's layout is physically impossible.
Wait, really? Impossible how?
You see windows in offices that should be buried deep underground. Vast ballroom interiors cannot possibly fit within the exterior walls. Hallways lead nowhere.
So these aren't continuity mistakes. They are deliberate psychological attacks on the audience and the characters.
Precisely. It is a calculated assault on spatial awareness. This creates a psychological slippage, a profound mismatch between expectation and experience, which is the hallmark of uncanny places. The mind registers the structural anomaly subconsciously, inducing a persistent sense of disorientation, a kind of architectural seasickness or dream logic.
The environment is designed to trap and confuse.
The hotel is a labyrinth, long before Jack ever steps foot in the hedge maze outside.
And that maze.
The hedge maze serves as the film's central visual metaphor, and it is a fascinating choice to replace the moving topiary animals of Stephen King's novel. Kubrick's maze represents the internal, convoluted architecture of Jack's burgeoning madness, the folding and trapping of the brain tissue. It is a physical manifestation of the logical loops and obsessive, perseverative thoughts that trap Jack.
So it's not a monster in the maze. Jack is the monster.
When Jack gazes over the scale model of the maze in the lobby, it underscores his patriarchal desire for omnipotence and control, the panoptic gaze turned inward. Yet the Minotaur in this specific labyrinth is Jack himself. His desperate pursuit of Danny through the frozen maze is his final, frantic pursuit of his own fractured ego. His death, frozen and assimilated in the center, signifies his total surrender to the structure, becoming a permanent part of the Overlook's history.
Let's discuss the critical sound element that anchors and simultaneously fractures the film's auditory world. The relentless, rhythmic sound of Danny's tricycle. Roar, hardwood, silence, carpet, roar,
A
silence.
tricycle sound, yes. This hypnotic, relentless auditory loop is mechanically perfect and highly critical to the film's tension. Danny is moving from the sharp, reverberating acoustic texture of the hardwood, which amplifies the sound to maximum volume, into the sound-deadening vacuum of the deep carpet.
That silence is almost louder than the roar.
It creates a predictable, almost obsessive rhythm of sound and silence. It functions as the psychological equivalent of a mechanical heartbeat within the vast, echoing silence of the Overlook. This sound is the only constant, the only thing that should be anchoring Jack to the reality of his son, but the output of his labor, his writing, proves that the anchor has already dragged along the bottom of the abyss.
The writing. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. It's terrifying precisely because it's meaningless, hundreds of pages of repeated text.
That is the complete disintegration of linguistic structure. Research into the language of stage 4 psychosis often indicates a severe breakdown in semantic and syntactic structure, manifesting as repetitive perserative text.
That's a symptom.
Jack's manuscript is not writing. It is a primal motor reflex, the desperate output of a brain suffering from sensory deprivation. We can view it as the prisoner's cinema, translated into language-complex visual patterns applied to utterly meaningless content.
All those different shapes and indentations.
It's a desperate attempt to impose form on content that is totally bankrupt. Jack is no longer communicating with an outside audience. He is communicating only with the mechanical, repetitive loop in his own head, amplified by the sound of the keys.
Okay, so The Shining is about a place that drives you mad. But what happens when the madness isn't in the walls, but in the blood?
Then you are in the crushing, isolated void of Antarctica. Then you are discussing John Carpenter's The Thing. And this is a horror of ontology, the study of being. It explores what we defined earlier as biological solipsism.
The primal fear that the person standing next to you isn't a person at all. Just a perfect biological machine with no soul, no consciousness, and zero empathy.
The creature weaponizes absolute isolation. It doesn't merely kill its victims, it assimilates them perfectly, retaining all memories, physical traits, and even speech patterns, but stripping away the human core. The film forces the characters into a radical, lethal skepticism. The central question shifts from where is the monster to the deeply insidious who is the monster.
Which anyone could be, at any time.
The ultimate horror is the loss of the individual's self to a collective, unthinking hive mind. The creature attacks the foundational elements of human trust and the communitarian values that are essential for survival in that deadly environment.
Wait, but if I was the thing, I wouldn't know it right. I'd think I was me. I'd have all my memories. I'd have my love for my family. I would have absolutely no idea my consciousness had been replaced by a cellular collective.
That, delivered with genuine fear, is the core truth of biological solipsism in this context. The certainty of the self is completely eroded. You could be the monster right now, and you wouldn't realize it until the moment the collective commands you to act.
Oh, that's awful.
The human me can be silently replaced by the alien, not me, without a single warning scream or internal alarm. In the absolute impermeable prison of Antarctic isolation, the body is no longer a sanctuary. It is a compromised battleground.
So everyone is an island.
This hyper-isolated environment transforms Outpost 31 into a pure closed system. Their survival scenario operates strictly on the principles of game theory, specifically the catastrophic prisoner's dilemma.
The prisoner's dilemma. Remind me.
Cooperation among the humans offers the only chance of survival. But the risk of cooperating with a single defector, a perfect biological imitation, ensures total collective death.
So suspicion and total isolation become the only rational choice for survival, even though that isolation will guarantee the group's psychological collapse.
Precisely. The game theory forces them into a scenario where the rational choice is self-preserving distrust, which ultimately destroys the group dynamic necessary to fight the external threat. This escalating fear of the other mind quickly mandates violence.
The blood test.
The blood test. The cinematic apex of this existential dilemma. It is a desperate makeshift tribunal of the flesh. They are literally tying each other down, forcing their peers to prove their humanity through a biological reaction, the thing's blood reacting to heat in self-defense.
It's their only option.
It is a frantic, isolation-fueled attempt to map the territory of the self, using the only tool left: imperfect science. But the film suggests science is fragile in the face of the irrational ontological threat. Even after the successful test, the paranoia lingers, because the white silence outside presses in.
The base becomes more dangerous than the storm.
Infinitely. And the soundscape of Antarctica must be playing a huge role here. The howling wind acts like a constant wall of white noise, blocking out any real information.
You can't hear anything useful.
That unrelenting howling storm functions as total sensory masking. It makes it impossible for the men to rely on their hearing for survival, isolating the base from the world and making their ears useless. Morricone's minimalist, pulsing score mimics the dread of an unstable heartbeat.
But it's the sounds you can't place.
It's the unseen, acousmatic sounds, the thumps in the ceiling, the squelching, the tearing clothes, that become the most intense sources of anxiety, precisely because their cause is hidden and unverified. The eyes are useless in the whiteout. The ears are constantly deceived.
And finally, the ending. The most ambiguous, nihilistic moment in isolation horror. MacReady and Childs freezing, sharing a drink. The fire dies.
The nihilistic standoff. The obsessive fan debate over the contents of that Scotch bottle whiskey or gasoline completely misses the profound philosophical point.
It doesn't matter what's in the bottle.
The truth of their biology, whether one or both is the thing, is secondary to the scene's fatal weight. The ending represents the futility of defining the mutable self in the face of absolute cosmic indifference. If one is the thing, they will both freeze shortly. If both are human, they will still both freeze shortly.
The outcome is the same.
The outcome is functionally identical. Total oblivion. It's a moment of total resignation. The white silence has stripped them of everything, their identity, their purpose, their hope, and ultimately claims them both.
It's not a victory, it's not a defeat, it's just a grim, shared toast to entropy.
Exactly. The cold one. The specific liquid in that bottle is irrelevant when facing the inevitable end of heat, light, and self.
So we had a prison of space, a prison of the self. What's left?
We shift now to Robert Eggers' The Lighthouse, which explores isolation not through impossible space or biological infection, but through the fourth dimension, time. This film is a pure, concentrated study in chronophobia, the fear of time, or more specifically, the deliberate destruction of linear temporal perception.
The two keepers are trapped on that rock in a grinding, repetitive cycle of labor. Shoveling coal, winding the clockwork, mopping the floors. It's the ultimate drudgery.
The isolation here is defined entirely by mechanical drudgery. The repetition of tasks, highly ritualized and brutal, functions as a modern iteration of the myth of Sisyphus.
Pushing the same rock up the same hill every single day.
As the storm rages relentlessly and the relief ship fails to arrive, the linear progression of days dissolves. The friction of normal life vanishes, replaced by the blank numbness of repetition.
The mind has no new input, no markers, so that hours and days start to merge into a single terrifying block of now.
The monotony, is the primary psychological catalyst. We hear Thomas Wake, the older keeper, asking, "How long have we been on this rock?" 5 weeks.
Yeah.
2 days. That exchange highlights the total, accelerating dissolution of chronological reality. The isolation creates such profound temporal anxiety that the men lose the ability to distinguish objective truth from subjective memory, leading them to rely entirely on the increasingly unreliable word of the other.
Don't do that. You just talked about chronophobia, and I'm genuinely checking the studio clock now. It's been 20 minutes since we started, I think.
That very insecurity about the precise duration of our conversation, that sudden need to verify the construct of time, is precisely the psychological trap laid by this environment. Time is fluid when it is not witnessed by others. In the lighthouse, there is only the blinding light and the relentless horn.
And the way it's filmed, it feels like a box.
The film's visual structure actively enhances this psychological constraint. Eggers' choice to shoot in the near-square 1.19.1 aspect ratio is not an aesthetic quirk. It is a profound psychological device. It creates a literal visual prison cell for the characters. There is no wide horizon to offer spatial relief, no panoramic vista to ease the mind.
You're trapped with them.
The narrow frame forces the audience's gaze inward, enhancing the claustrophobia and the intensity of the folie à deux, the shared, mutually reinforcing madness of the two men. It's like watching a nightmare unfold through a keyhole.
The visual constraint forces the two men into constant, intense proximity, boiling over their repressed rage and competition for control.
And their entire existence rapidly devolves to revolve around one object, the forbidden light itself. The lighthouse lamp serves as the classical Promethean flame, the forbidden knowledge, the desired object of power.
It's the only thing that matters.
In the absence of society, religion, or any objective purpose, isolation elevates objects. The light, the clockwork, the logbook to divine or obsessive status. Wake guards the light jealously, assuming the role of the jealous god or father figure. Winslow's growing obsession with the light is a desperate search for meaning in the existential void.
And when he finally gets it,
His final climactic ascent to the light is his moment of catastrophic enlightenment. He sees the cosmic, annihilating truth of the void, the nature of his own unconfessed guilt, and it destroys him.
he's left broken on the rocks, his liver eaten by seagulls, a Promethean victim of his own profound desire to stare into the ultimate white silence.
But the foundational terror of this film is primarily auditory. The constant grinding sound of the foghorn, day and night.
You can't escape it.
The sonic torture of the foghorn, this relentless, rhythmic, repetitive bellow, is a mechanical heartbeat that violently prevents deep sleep and violently invades the subconscious. It functions as a sustained form of sonic torture, a constant reminder of the physical danger and the insurmountable wall of their isolation.
It would drive you mad just by itself.
The foghorn contributes to the hypnotic fugue state of the narrative. The sound design blurs the fundamental line between man and machine. The grinding of the internal clockwork, the bellow of the horn, the howling of the wind, it all synchronizes with the madness.
Until you can't tell them apart.
By the end of the film, Winslow's ultimate scream blends seamlessly with the mechanical blast of the horn. He has become part of the machine, totally assimilated by the crushing routine and the rhythmic audio intrusion, just as Jack Torrance was assimilated by the Overlook's history. That acousmatic horn, that pervasive, invisible authority, controls their life and dictates their descent.
So, where does that leave us? All these prisons.
So let's synthesize what this journey through spatial, biological, and temporal prisons means. This audit of cabin fever, this deep dive into the white silence, is not merely cinematic fancy, it is deeply grounded in biological reality.
People have really experienced this.
This phenomenon has been documented repeatedly in real-world research into polar madness, or winter over syndrome. Antarctic explorers, such as Shackleton's men, or the tragic case of the 18th century Smalls lighthouse keepers, experienced severe, verifiable symptoms. Intense irritability, clinical depression, fugue states,
And
the documented phenomenon of the long eye, that fixed, isolated, utterly empty stare that suggests the soul has retreated inward.
the environment acts as a chemical solvent, dissolving the glue that holds the psyche together. The self is defined by external friction, by interaction, by the conformation of other minds. When the friction stops, the definition dissolves, and the shape of reality warps.
Cinema merely compresses this month-long psychological decay into a terrifying 2-hour nightmare. Ultimately, the white silence is the sound of the human animal realizing it is fundamentally alone in the universe, staring into a void that reflects back only its own chaos. So next time it snows and the power goes out and the crushing silence settles in, listen closely
To what?
to the sound of your own mind cracking.
How long we've been recording? 5 minutes. Or 5 weeks.